Hello, I'm Pip Willis, and welcome to the Atheist in Middle-earth, Stone of Annuminas series. Vision 1, Dark Fire, White Lightning. Magic in Middle-earth, what it is and how it works, and who can do it. So welcome to my rat hole here in Sydney, a minor temple of Tolkien, where I hope to introduce and explain in this series the Stone of Annuminas, the, I think, 5 major cryptic philosophical themes underpinning The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. These major cryptic themes lie sometimes deep under the surface, underpinning the story of Nine-Fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom. And that surface story, of course, is full of obvious and important themes such as friendship, fellowship, quest, response to evil, sacrifice, partings, the coming of age, change and departures. These are all surface themes that are well examined in the story. But all these themes are set in a deeply spiritual landscape, a landscape that's unnamed, it's hidden, it's only guessed at, it's mythical. You know, it's not fully understood, it's cryptic and spiritual, but so important, underpinning and informing everything in the surface story. But every now and again, one of these deep themes surfaces in the story like a great whale up from the depths, which gives us a glimpse of this spiritual underpinning of Middle-earth. The 5 great cryptic themes, I think, in The Lord of the Rings are 1. Magic, nature, evil, and the problem of evil, and the problem of evil, language, and death. In this vision, then we'll look at the first great whale, magic, both the good and the bad, the white lightning and the dark fire. And although underlying the surface story, magic is there almost all the time, in the sense that Gandalf is a wizard, whatever that is, and obviously magic rings, whatever they are. But the actual magic is under the surface and never really explained, apart from once, which is Gandalf's rather sparse, I had to use a word of command, if you'll recall, in the passage down from the Mars Arbor. As if we all knew instantly what he was talking about. Word of command. Oh yeah, because that's it. In fact, it's a very connective little phrase that kind of connects us, right in there in the action, as if Gandalf's almost talking to us. Saying, I had to use a word of command. Fair enough. I would have done too. And also the other magical possibilities are various, from minor to major. The possibility of being turned into a toad, the actual enchantment of beer. Great floods released, ravaging werewolves, to the righteous white lightning and the Eye of Sauron. And sure, magic is there all the time, but what is it? And who can do it? And how does it work? And if you recall to that lull just before the Mines of Moria, when they're just waiting before the door and Gandalf's kind of trying to figure out the word that will open the magic doors, Pippin says, why doesn't Gandalf do something? Quick! It's obviously referring to some kind of magical act. So in order to answer that question, we need to see magic operating on the surface of the story. And the very best sighting of magic, where magic breaks the surface in a vast and dramatic breach, is of course on the bridge of Khazad-Dum, where Gandalf literally spells it out in his heroic boast. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you. Flame of Udun, go back to the shadow. So lots of new phrases there, completely, Gandalf the Grey, kind of almost uncloaked fully, it's like, wow, all this stuff going on, tremendously exciting. So let's go through that, because these are these magic credentials that he's referring to. I am a servant of the secret fire. Okay, well, this one's a tough one. Takes quite a lot of explanation. The secret fire is a euphemism for the agent of Genesis, for creation, also known as the flame imperishable, and it's exclusive to the Godhead itself. In Tolkien's legendarium Eru Iluvatar, one All-Father. To be a servant of the secret fire, you have to have been chosen to act as God's agent within space and time, an angel in Catholic concept and fact, and one who has witnessed the cosmic plan and thus be the recipient of authority and knowledge, coupled with obviously innate spiritual power. So there's a lot there. So how do you get to witness the cosmic plan? Well, the entities that witness the creation of space and time, this cosmic plan, the Ainur, were conceived into being and given cogency in the mind of the Creator before and beyond, outside the creation of the universe. And these folk then, the Ainur, these angelic entities, through the euphemism of melody, in a great choir of the Ainur or the Ainulindale, they sing a music in 3 great movements under the conductorship of Eru Iluvatar, aka God. Now this is the music of the Ainur, and it is the cosmic plan for the universe, a kind of space and time construct that we all live in, which God then causes to be, and it is named Ea. Ru, or God, same thing here, then allows the Ainur to populate Ea and its principal stage, Arda. And thus some of the Ainur, not necessarily all, enter into space and time, but as beings, and the only beings within the plan that were from without it. And they know that plan to a greater or a lesser extent, in the sense that they can remember the music themselves as singers in the great choir. And it's as though they're singing, they effectively designed the cosmic plan. So one wouldn't expect one Ainur to know the whole symphony like God does, but he'd know his bit and he'd have a fair knowledge of what was going on, as you would do. Thus, to state that you are a servant of the secret fire, Gandalf is saying to the Balrog, which is a Valarauka in Quenya, which kind of breaks down to kind of Lord Demon. Valarauka? Lord Demon. And he's saying to the Balrog that he is of the Ainur, and he's been chosen as an agent of God, or as I say, in Tolkien's Catholic Codex, an angel, a messenger of and for God. For it is only God alone who has the agency of the secret fire. So that's what he's saying by secret fire, saying, I am being appointed by God, and the secret fire, of course, is that primary creation, otherwise known as the flame imperishable, which is to say the creative agency which is truly immortal beyond even the confines of Ea, i.e. the universe. So that's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm from beyond the universe and I have been chosen to be God's representative. So all that in, I am a servant of the secret fire. In real terms, in real kind of politic terms, it would be akin to a soldier saying he was in the elite, ultimate unit, subordinate and answerable only to the supreme leader, which, like the Praetorian Guard or the Immortals or something like that. Here, in fact, it's answerable to Manwë, and Manwë himself is the only conduit from Ea to God, Eru Iluvatar. So there's no higher service that can be claimed other than perhaps one of the Valar, the archangels, who are also Ainur and equally servants of the secret fire, only invested with a more powerful native spirit and therefore probably a stronger or a leading voice in the great choir, possessing greater spiritual knowledge of the whole, with greater power and insight, into Eru's thoughts, the whole kind of thought behind the plan. And all this is not mere supposition. This is made clear in Tolkien's letter to Waldman. And here it is, I'll read it out. He says, the Valar are angelic powers whose function is to exercise delegated authority in their spheres of rule and government, not creation, making or remaking. They are divine, that is, were originally outside and existed before the making of the world. Their power and wisdom is derived from their knowledge of the cosmogonical drama. So this is a funny one, actually. I was reading this and I just wrote cosmological drama, just did it without really thinking. And then I went back and checked. It was actually, no, Tolkien actually wrote cosmogonical. I thought, oh, that's a really weird word. And I looked it up and it says to do with the setting up of the solar system only. So it's amazing, isn't it? Tolkien has such a good command of English. He knows all these incredibly arcane and remote but perfectly suited words. What he's saying with cosmogonical is that the Valar are in effect principally and particularly concerned with Arda. As I say, Arda is the principal stage of Ea. So in terms of Tolkien's thinking here, there's the universe. Forget everything else. It's really all the main action is going on at Arda, and Arda is classically the inner solar system. So that's the Earth, the Sun, the Moon, Venus, Mars, Mercury. And at this time, when we're talking about this Arda thing, Earth in these early ages is the first iteration, including the now intangible element or continent of Aman, the blessed continent and associated islands, as well as indeed our very own Earth set amid oceans, in other words, Middle Earth. Okay, there we are. So thus, with the Secret Fire, Gandalf is unequivocally stating his true and spiritually mighty nature. Gandalf goes on to say he is a wielder of the flame of Anor. Anor, clearly Sindarin for the sun, and it's a direct reference to the power of the pure light, the first sun, which is actually the last fruit of Lorelin, the great light-filled golden tree of Valinor in Aman, where light and the spirit of the Godhead were mingled and were one and the same. There really are few more powerful spiritual forces than the sunlight filled with the direct spirit of God. And with his word wielder, Gandalf is telling the Balrog he's weaponized this spiritual force. We know it as a lightning, and it is referenced as Gandalf's kind of heavy-duty magic from the Battle of Five Armies to the Battle of Pelennor Fields. So then Gandalf goes on, still in his heroic boast here, when he's talking about magic. And he tells us of his opponent, the dark fire will not avail you. So what is this dark fire? So fantastic, isn't it? The dark fire is the counter and sub-creative power of Melkor, the greatest singer in the choir of creation, the Annuminas. And he's greatest by quite a long chalk. He's much, much greater than all the others, having originally placed within him native power surpassing all other Ainur, that is. And Tolkien tells us, to Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren, we're told. So that's from a Silmarillion. So now Melkor, he's much, much kind of greater than his peers, demands access to the flame imperishable to kind of create his own universes and be kind of like a god, as it were, like a main god, not like an archangel. I'm really trying hard not to deviate. It's so hard. So he wants the flame imperishable to create his own universes, but he is denied by Iluvatar. And so he rebels in Aru's despite. And now he's seeking to mar and destroy the plans of his peers. And he ruins the music that they're all singing with his discordancy. And this is the second movement of the music. So the first movement is kind of like all very happy and great. But the second movement, Melkor strives for the mastery and in fact gains it in the second movement. It's only with the corrective third movement of the music, the Annuminas, incorporating still the hatred of Melkor within it, where the plans for Ea are finally completed. And when the opportunity came to enter into Ea, Melkor took it with a legion of followers. So now, as a further opportunity to mar and destroy its structures to chaos. And this is how he entered it in a fantastic piece of writing from the Silmarillion, of course. And he descended upon Arda in power and majesty greater than any other of the Valar. As a mountain that wades in the sea and has its head above the clouds and is clad in ice and crowned with smoke and fire. And the light of the eyes of Melkor was like a flame that withers with heat and pierces with a deadly cold. Yes. So there he is. He's now within time and space with all that power. But, of course, he wants to destroy Arda. So in an attempt to achieve this destruction, he has to execute and invest his plans with his own innate power, because there's no more singing to be done. So he now has gone into Arda with his, power, and that's sealed. You can't kind of go in and out of air. He's gone in with that set power. And then he dissipates that power into Arda to achieve the goals that he wants to, which is obviously destruction and leading Arda to chaos, to kind of ruin everyone's plans. So he dissipates this as evil, and specifically with magic. He subcreates magical forms such as dragons and all the other kind of bad things as well. After many a long age of dissipating all his kind of innate power into the fabric of Arda, his power is all but dissipated. He is then vanquished in the War of Wrath, and he's banished from the construct of air. So he's actually chucked out. But he's chucked out a hollow and withered thing, a remnant or a vestigial thing of his former self. And off he goes, thrust through the doors of light. But not so his spiritual force that he originally brought with him into Arda. That remained in Arda, and that is the dark fire. So this is this dark spiritual force, a sub-created force, has to be said, also known as evil. And it is sometimes referred to as the Morgoth element, leached into Arda, specifically by Melkor, the Morgoth, the Black Enemy, to mar by evil the world to chaos. The dark fire then was basically taken up by the Balrog, a follower of Melkor, into Arda. Its native spirit infused with the dark fire, and the dark fire is there around for him to call upon and wield. So, in summary, thus dark fire is the spiritual artifice and weapon of Gandalf's enemy, the counter or sub-created evil fire of Melkor. It cannot create, only destroy as an agent of chaos. So there you are. That's the dark fire. Gandalf then identifies the Balrog, letting the Balrog know he knows that its nature is that of an Ainur. He says, "Flame of Udun." Now, Udun was the terrible fortress of Melkor, built by him on his first descent into the created world. So thus with Udun, Gandalf is identifying the Balrog as a denizen of Melkor's first stronghold, made long before the arrival of elves and men, and therefore only an abode of rebel Ainur, followers of Melkor, basically diabolical spirits or demons. Balrogs being very high-ranking demons, it has to be said. So with these words, basically, this heroic boast, Gandalf is saying, I'm a good and great magical spirit, authorised to use the good heavy magic, and you are a bad spirit, and your bad magic will not win, he hopes. Now, in this heroic boast, there's two kind of magical or spiritual components to consider, the multiple of which represents the overall spiritual power that can be brought to bear on the opponent. Who they are, personally, in terms of their native spiritual power, and then the spirit that they can summon up or gather and then wield. In Gandalf's case, say he's a servant of the secret fire and he has access to the flame of Anor. For the Balrog, he is a flame of Udun and has access to the dark fire. And here's what Gandalf tells us of their fight and respective spiritual weaponry in the Battle of the Peak. Lightning, they said, smote upon Slebdil and leapt back into tongues of fire. So lightning is the good and the tongues of fire is bad. And as we saw in this magical or spiritual battle, Gandalf only just prevailed, and in doing so was himself destroyed. So, so the dark fire did appear to avail the Balrog significantly. In terms of magic, it's often referenced in terms of flame and fire. This is because kind of the base Catholic understanding that obviously Tolkien constantly kind of is referring to as his kind of core myth that he believes in. And so when he's searching for euphemism, he'll go to his Catholic faith. And that's why I say it's just Catholic understanding. If you aren't aware, Tolkien was a very devout Catholic for all his life, pretty much. So, yeah. So, and in one of his letters, he explains the Lord of the Rings as principally a Catholic story. So when I'm saying things, that's because of Catholic understanding. That's because Tolkien was a Catholic. So when you consider Catholic understanding of light as an aspect of the divine, so too does Tolkien here in the Lord of the Rings. And light is a particularly good euphemism for the divine, for God, because of its kind of audacious victory over darkness, and particularly in terms of creativity. You know, let there be light, and there was light. And once you have that as the primary creation, the concept of flame or fire or light or whatever, then Melkor's light, or Melkor's sub-creative spirit, is going to be framed in the same context as, you know, fire or flame. So basically Melkor's sub-creativity mimics God's actual creativity, and those spiritual ephemeral things that are frequently referenced in terms of fire, flames. And as I say, that's because those things, they possess light as an ephemeral thing, you know, as like a visual spirit, often transformative, you know, when something's burning. So the light of a fire or a flame is seen by many different cultures as related to the spiritual. So that's what magic is. It's the application of spiritual force in the real world. That's great. So we know that. We know what magic is now. But how does it work? Well, now that's a good question, isn't it? So this is how it works. Artificers and wielders of the spirit, such as Gandalf and the Balrog, can effectively go into the spiritual stream of creation, as sung by the choir of the Ainur, the Ainundale, the blueprint for the universe, then created by God, on which the real world floats. So they can go into the spiritual component and make changes, which then manifest as magical changes in the real world. Much as if a code writer can go into a video game in which he is a character himself and make changes. To those entities in the game, that change would appear as magic. The greater the skill, knowledge and power of the manipulator of this spiritual world, the greater the magic. So that's easy, isn't it? So that's magic in Middle-earth is in real time to manipulate the music of existence, if you like, the spiritual world that informs and leads the physical world. And that spiritual manipulation or alteration, undertaken by one who has access to the spiritual dimension and can change it, manifests as a magical act. Now, the crucial points to this understanding of magic is that there is a preordained track, music, that can be manipulated by practitioners of the spirit, and that the universe follows it. You know, it's like a musical score that, as original composers, or folk that have a great understanding of the original music, they can go into the symphony and change the score. This is a very Catholic understanding of the universe, that it's all laid down. You know, it's a foregone conclusion. And that, you know, equally Catholic, that it can be accessed for good through faith and authority. Very much like a prayer that you know will be answered. So Gandalf is allowed to make magical changes as he sees fit, within his capacity to do so, and his remit of being a wizard. And that's a wizard with a capital W, i.e. one that's kind of an officially sent angel by Manwi as an agent of God. The Balrog, in this case, he has no restrictions, no application to authority. He was given access to the dark fire, or he took it up, literally ages ago when he decided to follow Melkor, and is fully undisclosed as to his native power. He's not limited externally in any way. There's no faith or discipline needed, only destructive power limited by his capacity to wield it, the dark fire. And if you think about that, it speaks a lot of Gandalf when you consider that as a wizard, he was fettered in terms of his native power. And indeed, the greatness of power he was given access to by the Valar. So the faith the Valar had in him. So what this basically means is that faith and authority are the gatekeepers of good magic. So let's break that down. What I mean by faith is to be able to go in and make a change, like Gandalf does here on the Bridge of Khazad-Dum. You really would need to have such a knowledge and belief and faith in the great music, in the plan that is going forward, in the spiritual construct of the universe under the conductorship of God, such as only really the angelic beings and some great elves have, and a great innate spiritual power to make such a change. So not only do you have to believe that there is a score there and the score's right and it's all going to plan, you also have to have the power to be able to make a change. So obviously Gandalf has that. For Gandalf, it's about his faith in the stewardship of the Valar also, particularly under Manwi, appointed by God. And that faith is that what should be, shall be. And that's kind of a reference to that kind of foregone plan. And those words spoken by Galadriel, indeed, to Frodo. The faith that the path is the right path, despite the setbacks, the doubts, the failures, that ultimately it will be blessed and the plan will pan out as per the foregone conclusion of the plan. Indeed, also to consider that faith is a two-way street. It also speaks of the faith authority, aka Manwi, has in him. And just as an aside, and I can't help it, this is a scripted aside, and I'm meant, because if you ever listen to any of my podcasts, they are just rambles and go, well, I just can't stop myself. It's so much more comfortable. I feel like I'm really on my best behaviour here, not to ramble. But this is an aside, this is a key insight into the Lord of the Rings, that as long as Gandalf keeps faith, his plan will work out. It'll work out around him, almost, such that any crazy bad choices that he makes will somehow pan out as great wisdom, and no matter what. And it's an interesting concept, isn't it? Like he'll make a bad decision, but somehow the world will make it actually become a great decision, and because of his faith, because the plan is going to work around Gandalf, kind of thing, because it's laid down that way. There's that much faith in him, and he has so much faith in the plan. So no wonder a more rational mind like Saruman would have issues with this. Okay. So the key to the spiritual dimension is faith, but only on the good side of the aisle. Faith, as I say, the spiritual master plan, and those appointed to administer it, the Valar, under the ultimate authority of the Creator. Faith and authority, but faith is more crucial. Lose your faith, and faith is lost in you. You lose your access to spirit, and you forget the big picture, and thus you lose your magic. Sounds familiar, Saruman? As for authority, in the use of access to good magic, it's also accessed via rank and permission, of course, as authority always is. Certainly on the good side of the aisle again, particularly with wizards, because that's effectively what a wizard is. The arbiters of that rank and permission are, I suggest, three. Firstly, the highest servants of the Secret Fire. I suggest the guardians of the Secret Fire would be a good name for them. The Valar, specifically the Adatar, the 8 lords of the Valar, as we heard, whose function, they were given a job, they were given these posts, whose function was to exercise delegated authority in their spheres. Secondly, we're talking about the arbiter of authority here. Secondly, the judgment of Manwi, the supreme servant of the secret fire, or I would suggest he would take a title something like the defender of the secret fire. And then ultimately and finally, upon only Manwi can call Eru Iluvatar, the creator, the god. So effectively, authority means Manwi, because obviously Manwi is also part of the Aratar, as well as the kind of ultimate in-universe authority. Manwi represented in Middle-earth, of course, by his great eagles. So this understanding is not the only understanding, but I think it's a good understanding because it seems to work. This understanding of good magic based on faith and authority neatly explains how Saruman's power transfers through pride and I think more importantly reason from spiritual power to temporal power, if you like, from spells to castles, which unfortunately for him is swiftly broken by the machinations of Gandalf the White in A Hard Day's Night. And why it's somewhat unfairly reversible. He's denied absolution by the Avalar, and that's because he was an apostate, a traitor to his faith. It's one thing being, not of the same faith, but to have been of the faith and then gone to another, that's an apostate, and that's like an even greater sin in terms of Catholic understanding of religion. And thus, at the end of the War of the Ring, he was only really left with his personal power, his voice, and his guile and intellect to daunt lesser minds. Maybe the Valar would have relented over time, maybe, but his attempted murder of Frodo on the threshold of Bag End probably swung the jury against him. Poor old Saruman. So there we go, faith and authority. Now, obviously, as an atheist, and this is indeed the atheist in Middle-earth, I have trouble with these concepts of magic. Not that non-understood changes in one dimension can affect another. Wonderful, inexplicable, magical things happen all the time. And indeed, I tend to agree with Arthur C. Clarke when he wrote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Which basically means magic is our ignorance. We just don't understand it yet. Now, such a view is a high conceit to Tolkien, of course. You can see it would be the antithesis of Tolkien's Catholic faith-based view of magic as divine, belonging to God. Because in which case, all of a sudden, an atheist is saying, "No, we'll get there in the end. We'll figure it out." And Tolkien's going, "Nah, that's God's." No, so I haven't got a problem with magic happening in Middle-earth. The problem is rather that the universe, the whole space-time continuum of the universe is all mapped out to a supreme being's order. And, that he answers prayers from his angels, or he lets them answer them themselves. So good magic, then, is this spiritual manipulation based on faith and authority. As I say, what I call the self-answered prayer. Bad magic comes down to innate spiritual power and capacity for the dark fire. No faith or authority needed. But before we just move on to the how, we just got to mention the Nazgul, because they feature large as icons of black magic in The Lord of the Rings. And they do have kind of a slight kind of recall to the faith and authority model, and indeed invested power, only with Sauron in place of Manwi. Their faith is a slavery, an unwilling compulsion arising from their rings, which Sauron holds. Their authority and power is derived from him alone, and thus their capacity to effect a magical power withers and waxes with their masters. Not all Nazgul. The Witch King is an exception, of course, being a mare spirit of the Aenir. He has also his own innate spiritual power derived from Eru, and thus he can cast a spell in his own right, even when Sauron's stock was really low, say at the beginning of the Third Age. He was still out there independently casting spells and working magic. And further, as his power waxes within the shadow of his master's power, he too can wield the dark fire. This is this incarnation of evil, as he so awesomely does at the gates of Minas Tirith, where it is written, "And with that he lifted high his sword, and flames ran down the blade." Those flames are the dark fire. And look also for the searing, and it's interesting because when Gandalf uses the lightning, it's always referred to as white lightning, but not at the breaking of the gates. Look for the searing lightning at the gates bursting. And I'll come to that in a minute. So that's the theory of how. Okay, so it's faith and authority, the self-answered prayer for good practitioners. For bad magic practitioners, it's all about their innate power and how much they can gather into themselves, the dark fire, and wield. But practically, so we read the Lord of the Rings, it's very rare that you actually kind of see them doing magic, these magical beings. But how do they do it? What is the keys to doing magic? Well, when you read the Lord of the Rings, most of the times when we see magic done, it's actuated by speech, and then sometimes song or chant. And language is often accompanied by a bodily movement. Here are some examples. Raising his right hand, he said in a clear and commanding voice, "Wake now, my merry lads, wake and hear me calling. Warm now be heart and limb, the cold stone is fallen. Dark door is standing wide, dead hand is broken. Night and the night is flown, and the gate is open." Tom Bombadil, of course, bringing back from the not quite, but almost dead. Quite magical that was. See if you can guess this was. Then the leader, who was now half across the ford, stood up, menacing in his stirrup, and raised up his hand. Frodo was stricken dumb. He felt his tongue cleave to his mouth, and his heart labouring. His sword broke and fell out of his shaking hand. That's easy, wasn't it? As soon as I said the leader. The Witch King at the Bruinen, of course. Okay, in the wavering light, Gandalf seemed suddenly to grow. He rose up, a great menacing shape, like the monument of some ancient king of stone, set upon a hill. Stooping like a cloud, he lifted a burning branch and strode to meet the wolves. They gave back before him. High in the air, he tossed the blazing brand. It flared with a sudden white radiance like lightning, and his voice rolled like thunder. "Now Anadrea Thaman! Now Danim Nargahoth!" he cried. It's Gandalf the Grey again, just before Caradhras, Razimbar, to all those Khazad-Dum speakers out there. I know there must be a few. I'm not sure. No, I'm not the only one. Again, just before there. Picking up a faggot, he held it aloft for a moment, and then with a word of command, it's spelt out there, with a word of command, Nawa and Adreth Amen. Amen does sound very much like amen, doesn't it? And that translates, I think, better in the moment to fire preserve us. Now, if you'll note the kind of structure of that word, it's fire preserve us. It really is, it's a prayer that he's doing. He's self-answering his own prayer. It's a recourse to faith that the log will burst on fire. Again, another one of Gandalf's, but this time just after the Marzabal. The counter spell was terrible. It nearly broke me. For an instant, the door left my control and began to open. I had to speak a word of command. There we go. Gandalf the White to Saruman this time. He raised his hand and spoke slowly in a clear, cold voice. Saruman, your staff is broken. There was a crack, and the staff split to thunder in Saruman's hand, and the head of it fell down at Gandalf's feet. And the points I'm trying to get across here is that pretty much all the magic is actuated through speech, but also bodily movement. That's an important thing that I'll come to in a minute. The Witch King again is another example, only in a more powerful iteration. Then the Black Captain rose up in his stirrups, cried aloud in a dreadful voice, speaking in some forgotten tongue, words of power and terror, to rend both heart and stone. Thrice he cried, thrice the great ram boomed, and suddenly upon the last stroke the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a flash of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground. Yeah, note the searing lightning, not white lightning. And there are many more examples, but the keys are words and movement. And in great works of magic, words become song and movement becomes dance. So words and movements by those in faith and authority are the actuators of good magic in Middle-earth. Okay, so good magic, bad magic, what's the difference? Well, essentially none, apart from good magic being caveated by faith and authority, as Gandalf points out to Gimli. "Dangerous?" cried Gandalf. "And so am I, very dangerous, more dangerous than anything you'll ever meet, unless you're brought alive before the seat of the Dark Lord." And it's to remember that Gimli hasn't even met a Balrog, so there you are. So Gandalf's laying it down there, and the fact is that his danger is identical to the danger of the Dark Lord. So there's no difference, in essence, to this spiritual manipulation. It's about what you do with it, whether you use it for good or for bad, depending on, of course, your point of view. Gandalf's breaking of Saruman's staff is almost identical as the Witch King breaking Frodo's sword. The Marzabal door was being magically wrenched both ways, similarly. And of course, the Palantari can be both a boon and a tool of evil. So the spiritual magic itself it's about how you use it. In terms of where good and bad lies on that line, Tolkien's own definition of good and evil will be useful to point out as he makes it clear in letter 181 to Michael Straight about good and evil. He says, "But since, in the view of this tale and mythology, power, when it dominates or seeks to dominate other wills and minds, except by the assent of their reason, is evil." So there you are, you see. So dominating power is evil, and thus it is with magic. Any magic that seeks to have an effect, a cogency over any other will without their consent is evil. So that's this kind of coercive projection of magical power is a deceit, because obviously the recipient of that would be unaware of it and they wouldn't have it. They've been deceived. So this bad magic is a deceit or a sorcery, but an enhancing good power over self, a good magic, is an art or an enchantment. And this is indeed spelt out for Sam by none other than Galadriel herself. She says, "For this is what your folk would call magic, I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean, and they seem to use the same word of the deceits of the enemy. But this, if you will, is the magic of Galadriel. Did you not say that you wish to see elf magic?" I actually think that Sam did pretty well here by noting the difference in how magic was used by specifying elf magic. And it was kind of Galadriel, Tolkien, who generally did not kind of understand the non-ambiguity of the word magic, to mean any spiritual manipulation manifesting in the real world. But you recall, either way, she was very clear on warning the hobbits and getting their agreement and consent, and only then were they allowed to see the enchantment in her mirror. Speaking of her mirror, we've just got to touch on artifacts, magical artifacts. Evidently, there are many magical artifacts in Lord of the Rings. And this technique, it's artisanry, if good, or technology, or machine, if bad, was first recordedly accomplished by Fëanor, the Noldo, famously incorporating the light of the two trees, the sacred godlight, into imperishable crystal, the Silmarils, sacred shine, if you like. I translate Silmarils as sacred shine, or radiance, sacred radiance, probably better. Essentially, what it's doing is imbuing the artifact with a spirituality. It's a kind of a key to the spiritual stream, underpinning and leading the real world, that gives rise to magical, aka spiritual outcomes or occurrences. So with these artifacts, we have healing brooches, magical doors, both good and evil, seeing stones, mirrors, magical swords, both good and bad, resistive and aggressive, star glasses, of course, rings, of course, even magical soil. We have magical rope, cloaks, magical food and drink, and ultimately magical ships. So again, it's these artifacts that are imbued with a spiritualness, spirituality, which can bring about spiritual outcomes in the real world, or magical outcomes in the real world. Okay, so that's artifacts. So who can do this? Who can do magic in Middle-earth? Never mind whether they should or not. Well, any entity that can manipulate the spiritual score, the underlying dimension leading the real world. So firstly, that's any of the folk of the Ainur who entered into Ea. Any of the angels or demons, to a lesser or greater extent, because they were initially invested with native spirit before the creation of the universe, and thus they have spiritual power. And they sang, or part sang, part designed in the choir of the Ainur, and thus they have the knowledge as well of the supreme plan to a greater or lesser extent. The greatest of these magical workers in Middle-earth, we find in the Lord of the Rings, is of course Sauron. And thus, despite being occluded and denied much of their native spiritual power, which would daunt the men that they were sent to help, the five wizards, they were angels, and to a greater or lesser extent able to practice magic, under the caveats of their wizardry, their ability, and of course, as we explained, faith and authority. All elves had an access to and knowledge of the spiritual realm, but most were unable to kind of manipulate it to work magic. Only very few, particularly knowledgeable and powerful ones, were, particularly if they were enhanced indeed by a magical ring. And that I'm talking about Elrond and Galadriel here. This they did, and of course, I suppose, Celebrimbor before them, and indeed Círdan, when they took this magic, these enhancers, they did so without authority. When I was talking about good magic, it's accessed by faith and authority. Well, they had the faith component, but they didn't have the authority component, and that's why the elven rings, despite being good, were wrong. And that's why part of Galadriel's repentance and penitence after that was her return to faith with the words that what should be shall be. So she's acknowledging that the plan should be followed. She didn't quite get around to actually saying, I shouldn't have used the rings, but when she, I'm obviously meandering, it's the history of Celeborn and Galadriel and Unfinished Tales, and she's talking about when Celebrimbor came to see her and in the Second Age, and he gave her the ring, and she says something like, we didn't have the strength to not take them. So in other words, she fell to temptation to her own power. It's like a mini One Ring there. Unscripted aside. Right, that's elves. Yeah, we talked about elves. So this duality, or this knowledge of the spiritual realm, is true of many magical creatures. They had an access to and a knowledge of the spiritual, and they were, maybe created by a magic, or had magic done unto them, but they had no power to actually manipulate the spiritual, to make magic. Unlike Gandalf or the Balrog, they couldn't actually make magic, though they had magic about them. They couldn't actually have the power to actually, or the authority, but even if they were on the wrong side of the aisle, on the dark side of things, they didn't actually have the power to actually make a change, like the 8 Nazgul, for instance. So particularly on the dark side of the aisle, there's trolls, orcs, werewolves, watchers in water. Now this is an really interesting little insight from Gorbag on the spiritual realm as seen from the other side of the aisle.
No, I don't know, said Gorbag's voice. The messages go through quicker than anything could fly as a rule, but I don't inquire how it's done. Safest not to. Urgh, those Nazgul give me the creeps. They skin the body off you as soon as look at you and leave you all cold in the dark on the other side.
It's quite revealing, that, isn't it? So all those questions about whether do orcs have souls? Yeah, they do. Gorbag knows. So he's displaying their knowledge of and access almost to the spiritual and thus magical, but no ability to manipulate it. So Gorbag couldn't make magic. He couldn't cast a spell, nor could any kind of normal elf. Treebeard is an exception. Through, I assume, great longevity and the original gift from magical elves, he possessed an ability in a tree-ish way to make a limited magic in his drafts, his big drinks from Merry and Pippin. But not so the Hurons. Though magical, they could not do magic, again, beyond their magical nature, so they could move quickly and grip and strangle with their roots, but they couldn't cast a spell. But the big point here is that men were absolutely not magical. Some may have some knowledge of the spiritual plan through lore learned from the elves, but they did not have access to the spiritual dimension of Ea like an elf. The elves, they obviously, they live in both realms, real and spiritual, simultaneously for the duration of the cosmic plan. But men, their gift was to be a guest in Ea within the construct and see it for a lifetime and then escape. And Tolkien tells us this in letter 155. Anyway, a difference in the use of magic in this story is that it is not to be come by lore or spells, but is an inherent power, not possessed or attainable by men. So there you are. Men are out. They cannot use magic. Of course, there is one exception. Aragorn. Actually, there's two, but I'll explain why there's actually only really one. Aragorn, of course, who Tolkien explains in regards to his limited magical abilities, which is, he has some foresight, he has some necromancy about him, and he has some kind of healing about him. Tolkien explains that he's not a pure man, but at long remove, one of the children of Luthien, the vastly powerful elf maiden, daughter of an angel. So there you are. He's kind of squeaking out of that one, going, well, Aragorn wasn't a true man. He wasn't pure man. He had a little bit of good stuff in there, so it allowed him to be a little bit magical. But it also has to be mentioned that the green jewel, the elf stone, was indeed an elvish magical gem of healing. And as for his foresight, I think we all knew it was a bad idea for Gandalf to lead the Fellowship into Moria. The only other exception to being magical and men that we know of is Isildur and his successful cursing and necromancy of the people of Erech. So I have to kind of explain that, because Tolkien's categorically said that men are not magical, but here we see in Isildur it appears that he is. So how do we get around that one? Well, we come back to a prayer and the concept of when Gandalf or anyone, they're basically summoning on faith and authority. So when Isildur makes his curse, it's just that. It's actually a prayer. And rather surprisingly, and mostly one heard after his death, Isildur's death, his prayer is answered. Now, ex-universe, this is very easy to understand. Of course, Tolkien needed a Deus Ex Machina to win against the extremely high odds against the forces of good in the Eucatastrophe at the Pelennor Fields. In universe, Isildur, he must have invoked the Valor in his curse prayer, which would have been heard by Mandos. And he's one of the supremely powerful ruling archangels of Valor, the Aratar, who alone had the power to halt or delay men's gift of death from being delivered. So this then, with the consent of Manwë, the king of Arda, was allowed to occur. And then a vision of this part of the spiritual score being altered is given to Malbeth the seer, and then at long remove relayed to Aragorn. And he completed the magic. by basically turning up at the right place at the right time. So Aragorn's magic here is not really magical of himself, but it's part of Mandos's magic. All Aragorn needed was faith and bravery, which is still pretty magical in a human atheist sense. So there you see. So that part of Isildur and Aragorn, that magic, is actually an answered prayer by Mandos. The cardinal point really here is that men cannot practice magic, and so when a magic doer is referenced, it is not a man. And of course, I'm again referring to the Witch King. He was a sorcerer, and thus specifically an evil magic doer, which means he must have been either a very powerful elf, which is unlikely, or a male spirit invested into the body of a man like Gandalf was, and then of course either originally was turned to a demon, or I like to believe, because of the scarcity of male spirits in Middle-earth, that he was one of the blue wizards turned from an angel to a demon by Sauron the Deceiver. The other 8 Nazgul are pure men or women, and again they've had magic visited upon them with their elven rings that are magical, rather than being magical of themselves. Their great power is the inculcation of fear, but they cast no spells. Their souls enslaved by their elven rings and the master ring, and thus unable to accept their gift of death, until of course the rings are destroyed, and then they flee to Mandos for their gift, and I presume in hope for some judgment. Okay, so that's who can do magic. Basically just the Ainur really. And now, what is the significance of magic? And this is a really interesting point as well. Tolkien, through his kind of crypto-Catholicism in The Lord of the Rings, links his magic through spirituality and faith and authority in the supreme cosmic plan to the power of God. Thus, when we see magic in Lord of the Rings, we are seeing movement of the spiritual, which to Tolkien in his faith represents the ultimate point. And that is a really interesting observation, that through the existence and application of magic, Tolkien sees and shows evidence of God. Magic is divine. Thus, every magical act, from the smallest, such as the improvement of Barlaam's beer, to the greatest, the destruction of a mighty demon, is in effect a miracle. Bad magic, of course, being diabolical, but since rebel, its source is still ultimately divine. The wider significance of this is that Tolkien saw all myth in the same way, that Vulcan was Hephaestus, was Thor, was St. Michael. That they're just different versions of the same thing, the divine. And therefore, that his book, Lord of the Rings, and the whole universe, was just as credible a version as any other myth. And he kind of pats himself on the back in his poem Mythiopia by saying, "Blessed are the legend makers for seeing this myth as a concept of the divine, and that God expressed himself in the real world through these glimpses of magic relayed in myth." And as I say, this is exactly what he means when he explains that The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally a Catholic story. It's just another version. Myth then to Tolkien was really the only way that men could really see and understand the concept of God, and that these myths were goads to faith, and ultimately to the true myth, the greatest eucatastrophe of all, the birth, suffering and resurrection of Jesus Christ, in Tolkien's opinion. But, there's a big but. If I thought The Lord of the Rings was just a Catholic manual, I wouldn't bother with it. But the magic of The Lord of the Rings goes much deeper and much further. So So that's the significance of the Lord of the Rings for Tolkien. But for an atheist, the magic is about the magic of the Lord of the Rings. And I'll explain that. Since Tolkien so cleverly kept his Catholicism cryptic in the Lord of the Rings, the evident spiritualism attracts all humans who have a spiritual element or desire or need within them, which, I think basically is all humans. Or as Tolkien says in his own words, he says, why it, that's the Lord of the Rings, has proved readable for a large number of very different kinds of people. Well, he thinks they're very different kinds of people. They're not. They're all one kind of people, really. They're one kind of people that have a spiritualism in them. They're a yearning, a spiritual desire, the fact that there's more to it than just the human facet of life. He explains how he feels about the magic of the Lord of the Rings. This is a wonderful piece of writing. I feel as if an ever-darkening sky over our present world has been suddenly pierced. The clouds rolled back and an almost forgotten sunlight has poured down again. Isn't that wonderful? That's how he feels about, as soon as the Lord of the Rings was published, he felt that spiritualism, the magic of the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien eventually reasoned that he had been an instrument of God in writing the book, but he explains of its sanctity to another correspondent. You speak of a sanity and sanctity in the Lord of the Rings, which is a power in itself. I was deeply moved. Nothing of the kind has been said to me before. But by a strange chance, just as I was beginning this letter, I had one from a man who classified himself as an unbeliever, or at best a man of belatedly and dimly dawning religious feeling. But you, he said, create a world in which some sort of faith seems to be everywhere without a visible source, like light from an invisible lamp. I can only answer, of his own sanity no man can securely judge. If sanctity inhabits his work, or as a pervading light illuminates it, then it does not come from him, but through him. And neither of you would perceive it in these terms unless it was with you also. Otherwise, you would see and feel nothing, or, if some other spirit was present, you would be filled with contempt, nausea, hatred. Leaves out of the elf country. Ah! Lembas! Dust and ashes. We don't eat that. But we, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Jew, even atheist, perceive this spiritual light of Tolkien's magic, and that it finds and feeds and nourishes our spiritual desire. That is of itself magical, and is, of course, his supreme achievement, his invitation to spirituality. For atheism is not nihilism. I hope. Thanks for watching.